This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. Sticking to the road. Several men had fanned out on either side and were walking quietly through the forest with swords drawn. They're looking for someone, but it's not us, Jade whispered. I guess I speak Latin too, she added with a shrug when Phoenix looked questioningly at her. He realized then that he too understood the low conversations that carried to them. Bryn nodded in agreement. I can't hear who it is, but they definitely want him pretty badly. They have orders to take him straight back to the governor in Londinium. The boy shivered, clutching his thin shoulders. Wouldn't want to be that guy. Let's get deeper into the woods. The Romans probably won't come too much further in. He tugged at Jade's sleeve. She nodded and slipped in behind his small figure. Phoenix glanced once more at the nearest soldiers. He felt strangely reluctant to run away like this. It felt wrong to his warrior self. He should be out fighting the Romans, not skulking away like a coward. He remembered the task they'd been set. They only had a few days to get the jewel and thwart both Feng Judai and the Romans. No time for fun. Sighing with regret, he got a grip on himself and followed the other two deeper into the green gloom. They didn't risk another path for a long while. Even when they found one that seemed to lead in the right direction, they were wary and tense. There was little speech between them, and no thought of stopping to rest or go to the toilet. Some of the fun had worn off the day. There was more than a hint of danger in the air. Jade drew her cloak tighter about her slender, peering into the forest in all directions. What's wrong? Phoenix whispered. I feel. She glanced around again, like someone's watching us. Phoenix felt it too, a strange prickling on the back of his neck. There was someone, or something, watching them. Had the Romans found them? Surely they wouldn't just watch. They'd charge in and capture by force of numbers. Not the Romans, then. So who? Bryn's forest folk. From the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement. On the left, he murmured. Jade and Bryn nodded in silent agreement. Bryn slipped his sling from his pocket and casually loaded a stone into it. Jade held her staff in both hands. Phoenix loosened his sword in its sheath. They padded on, deeper into the woods. Only moments later came a cry of shock and pain from somewhere off to their left. It was followed by a strange creaking, like the timbers of an old house settling at night. Then the sound of a blade chopping into wood. More creaking. A human voice cried out again, this time a call for help. The three companions stopped, exchanging wary looks. The yell became more desperate, the creaking louder. Jade chewed on a fingertip and took a step toward it. Bryn grabbed her arm. He's speaking in Latin. It's a trap, my lady. Don't go. Why would they bother with a trap? They have hundreds of soldiers. She shook off his grip. No, that's someone in trouble. Come on, Phoenix. Please. Phoenix nodded, sword hand itching. Suits me. Whoever it is, we need to shut him up before he draws every soldier for 3 miles around anyway. Together, the players pushed through a screen of bushes. Behind them, Phoenix heard Bryn swear. Then the boy caught up, sling ready. Jade pulled up short at the sight beyond. In the center of a large clearing stood a massive tree. Its canopy of small, dark green leaves reached at least 10 meters in every direction. Its trunk a thick and ancient tangle of ropey aerial roots bound together. She frowned. This is wrong, she murmured. It's a strangler fig. They only grow in the tropics of Southeast Asia, not here. Don't forget where here is at the moment, Phoenix reminded her. The programmers can put anything they want, anywhere they want, remember. There was a gasp from Bryn, who had just appeared at his side. The boy raised a shaky finger. Look. They followed his finger and saw a young man, about their own age, entangled in the dangling roots of the tree. They were wrapped around his limbs and torso from ankle to neck. The sword he had been trying to chop himself free with had fallen now from a limp hand. His face was dark red, his eyes closing as he gasped for breath. "How?" Jade began. "It's a strangler," Bryn said. "They catch their prey this way. He's done for." "Not if I have anything to do with it," Phoenix grinned, snatching his sword out and striding forward. 3 swift slices detached the roots, encircling the boy's neck. They swung uncontrollably through the air as though lost. The stranger gasped, blood draining from his face as breath returned. He began to struggle again. Phoenix waded in, hewing at the thicker vines twisted around his torso. Every time his sword bit into wood, reddish sap oozed out like congealing blood. A thin, high-pitched squealing began to echo in the clearing. Jade clapped her hands over her ears. Suddenly, dozens more ropey vines dropped down from above, lashing wildly about, stretching toward Phoenix and the tree's victim. Phoenix yelled in alarm as one connected and immediately tightened around his ankle. It yanked. He slashed at it as he fell, freeing his foot just as he hit the ground. Winded, he staggered upright, panting for breath. The stranger was once more cocooned and suffocating. Phoenix raised his sword, hacking again and again at the branches. "Wait!" Jade screamed, her hands pressed tightly to the side of her head. "Wait! You're hurting it!" "That's the idea. It's killing him," he shouted back. Jade ran forward, grabbing his sword arm. "Wait, please, let me talk to it." A thrashing root reached for her. Phoenix severed it in one clean blow. She winced. "Please," she begged him. "I can make it stop. I know I can. Bryn, give me that rabbit you hunted earlier." Phoenix glanced at the entangled stranger. His eyes were closed again, his movements feeble. "You'd better be right and make it fast, or he'll be dead in a few seconds." He backed away, out of reach of the seeking tendrils. Jade dropped her staff and stepped into them, holding the rabbit in one hand. The tree tendrils shivered, reaching for her like 1,000 thin fingers. Bryn cried a warning. Phoenix held him back as he tried to rush to her rescue. She closed her eyes and let the tree encompass her completely. There was silence in the clearing. Breathless moments passed. Phoenix cursed his own stupidity. It wasn't going to work. Now both of them were caught and he couldn't chop them free fast enough. Growling, he raised his sword again and took a step toward Jade's swathed shape. Abruptly, the branches and roots fell away, vanishing up into the canopy and into the ground. Jade stepped free unharmed, like a magician's assistant revealed after a trick. Her hands were now empty. The stranger collapsed unconscious to the ground. She ran to his side, pulling out her herb bag. Laying hands on his chest and head, she closed her eyes. A purplish haze shimmered around her hands as she healed him. He sucked a deep breath, his eyes flying open to fix on her face. Remembered horror dawned and he sat up, staring at the now dormant tree towering overhead. "It's okay," Jade assured him. "It won't hurt us now. I gave it some food and asked it not to." He stared at her, shock and lingering pain in his eyes. You asked it?" She nodded. "But I think we should leave its territory. Phoenix did hurt it and it's not very happy with us. Can you get up?" She rose, staggering, a hand to her head as if in pain. The stranger nodded. Scrambling to his feet, he put an arm around her waist, steadying her until she could walk. Then he picked up a bow and quiver of arrows from the ground nearby, regathered his sword, and held it tightly, glancing again at the quiescent tree as they moved far out of its reach. "You all right?" Phoenix asked Jade as the two approached. She nodded. Just a difficult healing. He had broken ribs and a collapsed lung. It took a lot of energy. We should keep moving, though. That made a lot of noise. It might bring the Romans straight to us if we stay. Ha! Too late, Bryn spat. He is a Roman. See? He pointed at the distinctive gladius sword in the young man's hand. A soldier, I'd say. It was a trap, and he's the bait. His cohort will be here any minute. Phoenix raised his own weapon, eyeing the newcomer warily. This boy man was strong-looking, but Phoenix thought he could probably take him in a fair fight. They would be close-matched. He seemed to be about 16 years old, but carried himself confidently, like someone older. He was almost as tall as Phoenix, with short black hair and a long, straight nose. His eyes were dark in a strikingly handsome face. His short tunic and cloak were plain, but of good cloth and well made. A heavy gold ring glinted on the little finger of his left hand. Jade laid a hand on the Bryn's shoulder and held him still. She retrieved her quarterstaff, but didn't raise it. Tilting her head, she seemed to assess the stranger. "You're Roman, but you're not a soldier, are you? Who are you?" "No, I'm not yet a soldier, my lady." The stranger bowed gracefully. There was an air of calm resolution about him, now that danger was past. His face was composed, eyes steady. He sat down on a fallen log and drew a long, slow breath. It was not the action of a man about to attack them, so the others slowly lowered their weapons. "But I am the son of a Roman soldier." He held up a hand as Bryn muttered under his breath. "I am no threat to you, though. Indeed, I would call you friend, for you are my enemy's enemy." "What does that mean?" Phoenix asked. "Which enemy?" "We're starting a collection." "I have forsworn my Roman heritage," the stranger replied with dignity. He gazed into the distance for a second, and Phoenix saw a brief look of pain on his handsome features. There was a short, awkward silence. He seemed to be the sort of person who spoke little and thought long and hard before he did. "I don't like what it means to be Roman in the land of the Bretons. We slaughter all who resist us and kill the fair folk, like yourself, my lady, for no reason except that we are frightened of them." He glanced at them. "It's wrong, and I won't be part of it." The tension drained from all three companions as they sensed his honesty. Phoenix sheathed his sword and reached down a hand. "We should keep moving. What's your name?" "Marcus," came the answer as the boy gripped his hand and pulled himself upright. "Yours?" "I'm Phoenix. This is Jade and Bryn." He indicated the others. "I'm indebted to you all for a timely rescue." Marcus bowed. "Especially you, my lady." Jade blushed and smiled faintly at him. Bryn glowered. They moved off through the greenwood, putting distance rapidly between themselves and the uncanny tree. As they walked, Marcus looked at each in turn. An odd group, a Breton warrior with a Greek name, an elven woman walking abroad in daylight, and a child. "Are you pledge partners, and this your son?" He jerked his head and Bryn. Phoenix started, and almost laughed at the thought. He hid the laugh with a cough, realizing it would be hard to explain that he was actually only 13 years old, and could hardly be the father of a 10-year-old. He kept forgetting this body was more like 18. He exchanged a glance with Jade, who gave an embarrassed half-laugh and shook her head, as she too must have realized what he meant by pledge partners. Phoenix tried to look cool, but decided he probably only succeeded in looking flustered. "No, we're not. together. Bryn, we met by chance. He's our guide, he managed. He was never going to hook up with anyone. After a few moments of awkward silence, Marcus took up the conversation where he had left off. So if you're not married, why do you carry matching blades? He nodded toward at the knife Phoenix carried in his belt. Phoenix swapped startled looks with Jade. She snatched her own knife from her belt and examined it. He moved over and held his beside hers. Marcus was right. They weren't identical. Jade's was bronze rather than iron, but both knives were decorated in a similar way. Phoenix touched a finger to each of the 7 small rubies embedded in the hilt of her knife and in his. They glowed faintly. Jade whispered, obviously not wanting the others to overhear. The rules did say we have 7 lives in the game. Could these show how many lives we have? Phoenix turned his knife over. I don't know, but the old woman in the gray place said that if we failed, we'd die in our world, too. If these are extra lives, at least we have some chance of succeeding. 7 isn't very many when you consider what we're up against, she shot back. She was right. 7 lives didn't seem like much when they had 5 levels of the game to complete. It was a frightening thought, and Phoenix saw the fear in her eyes again. There were so many dangers in this world, and they knew so little. He'd been an idiot to remind her. He looked up to see Marcus and Bryn watching them, acting casual, like it was nothing important. He muttered, "Let's work it out later," and moved away. He needed time to think. That was hard to do with Marcus and Bryn watching his every move. It was a relief when the Roman boy asked a different question. "Where are you going?" Phoenix hesitated. They didn't know this guy. He said he was an enemy of Rome, but could they believe him? He might be a spy. On the other hand, how could the Romans possibly know they were even in the forest to be spied on? He compromised, giving a part answer. "We're following the river for a while, heading west. You. Are you the one the Romans were looking for today?" He nodded. "I escaped from an encampment just over the hill yesterday morning. My father sent men after me. I've been keeping only just ahead of them for the last 2 days. I don't know these woods, and I'm afraid I'll stumble straight onto the Legion if I keep going in circles. That's why I was following you. You seem to know where you were going." "And now?" Phoenix prompted. "We're heading deep into the woods. Bryn here knows the paths, but we don't and you don't. Where are you going to go now?" Marcus scanned their faces as though wanting to ask an important question, but afraid the answer mightn't be what he wanted. "Honestly, I was hoping I could travel with you for a while. At least until we're out of these woods and away from my father's men." Phoenix glanced at Jade. She raised one eyebrow and held up 2 fingers as if to say, "Companion number 2. He twisted his mouth. He wasn't sure about this Marcus guy. They were already a walking target, with Jade being a half-elf, and therefore wanted by the Romans. If they added a runaway soldier's son to their group, wouldn't it be even harder to evade the troops? We'll definitely meet more Romans on this trip. He watched the Roman boy's handsome face. Are you able and willing to kill them if you need to? I won't let them take us, and I won't risk Jade's life or Bryn's to rescue you if you get captured. Marcus held his gaze for a few moments. He pulled his bow off his shoulder. Notching an arrow to the string, he drew and released it in one smooth movement. The arrow flew through the gloom and thunked into a tree trunk over 30 meters away. Able? Yes. Willing? Definitely, he said grimly. I don't want to see the fair folk destroyed either. He bowed toward Jade. She blushed again and glanced away. Phoenix looked skeptically at the arrow. It wasn't too hard to hit a tree. The shot wasn't a great indication of his skill as an archer. Even as he opened his mouth to say so, Bryn gasped and ran forward. He jerked the arrow out with an effort. Something small and dark fell to the ground. Bryn picked it up gingerly and brought it and the arrow back. He dropped the dark thing into Phoenix's palm and handed the arrow back to Marcus with a look of reluctant respect. In Phoenix's hand lay a large, gray-brown moth. He glanced again at the tree it had been on. Okay. He was willing to concede that hitting a camouflaged moth at that distance in the uncertain light under the canopy was pretty darned good shooting. Phoenix caught Jade's eye and she nodded slightly. Bryn screwed up his mouth and nodded his agreement. "Very well," Phoenix said. "You're welcome to join our odd little group as long as you like. But I warn you, it's not looking like an easy trip. Hope you're prepared for the worst." Marcus grimaced. What could be worse than that tree thing? Bryn sent him a knowing look. That was nothing compared to what else lives in this forest, Roman. Chapter 9. Dusk swept in, and they managed to elude the Roman trackers all day. Phoenix was conscious that they hadn't made great time in the forest, and was all for pushing on into the night. Since Jade was the only one with decent night vision, however, he finally agreed to stop after twice tripping over branches and roots sticking out onto the path. They searched for a suitable hidden campsite. 2 huge fallen logs served well, once they'd laid leafy branches between as a makeshift roof. Marcus made a small, hot fire from wood gathered close by. They screened it carefully on all sides with stones and branches, so the glow could not be seen at a distance. Bryn and Jade found a few herbs and early forest foods, while Phoenix plucked and gutted a pheasant Bryn had brought down with his sling earlier. He skewered it on a green stick and began to turn the spitted bird above the fire. After they ate, there wasn't much left to do except sleep, and they were all tired enough to do that easily. Phoenix opted to take first watch. Marcus volunteered to take second, Bryn third, and Jade the last. Phoenix resolved to stay awake through Marcus's watch, just in case. He kind of trusted the young Breton boy not to murder them, at least, but trusting a Roman seemed stupid. It wouldn't hurt to keep a close eye on him for a while. Anyway, seeing the others settled, Phoenix wrapped himself in his cloak and sat with his back to the fire. Peering into the chill darkness around them, he found himself hoping very much that nothing would emerge to attack them. They were deep in the forest, but had yet to see evidence of Bryn's mysterious forest folk. He now realized, however, that the feeling of being watched had not gone away. He still had the urge to look over his shoulder, still felt the uneasy sensation of being followed. Marcus's eyes had not been the only ones on them. Fortunately, the cool spring night passed without incident. Each watch reported no trouble, and the weary travelers rested well. At the first light of pre-dawn, Jade woke them, telling Phoenix she wanted to get an early start. He grumbled a little, but couldn't really argue when she pointed out the time deadline facing them. He ran his fingers through matted hair and watched her touch Marcus on the shoulder. Marcus sat straight up, his eyes wide, and a small knife in his hand. He murmured an apology, and without explanation, tucked the knife into a sheath strapped to his calf. Jade stared at him, clearly shaken. Phoenix frowned. What made him so jumpy? Bryn jumped straight up without complaint. He disappeared for a few minutes, returning with a handful of pheasant eggs and mushrooms. Jade inspected the fungi and pronounced them safe to eat before cooking them in her little pot into a sort of messy scrambled eggs. With a full stomach and a good night's sleep, Phoenix hoped they'd cover more ground today. They'd lost a lot of time avoiding the Romans, rescuing Marcus and taking devious paths through the woods yesterday. They still had over 100 kilometers, 45 leagues, to cover. Going through the rough paths of the forest and fields, it would probably take them 4 more days at least, if they didn't encounter anything unexpected. The equinox was only about 5 days away by Jade's elven calculations. Any delays on the road could be disastrous. The morning went quite smoothly, so smoothly that even Jade began to look more relaxed. The weather held cool and clear. For almost 2 hours, Bryn led them through the dark woods without incident. By mutual consent, they worked their way closer to the road again, out of the deepest, creepiest part of the woods. For the most part, their path was easy, almost boring through the dappled, cool green. Lacking other distractions, it wasn't long before Bryn and Marcus began a competition to see who the best marksman was. After Bryn brought down 2 pigeons, and Marcus a hare and a pheasant, Jade called a halt to their little contest. "At this rate, you'll waste all your ammunition, and we'll have more food than we can possibly carry or eat," she said. "Have some sense. Would you both?" Bryn grinned and handed Phoenix a bird to carry. "With 2 big tough warriors to feed, I don't think that's possible." He ducked when Phoenix reached out to slap him lightly across the head. Marcus said nothing. He drew himself up and bowed his head in stiff acknowledgement of the reproof. Jade flushed as he turned sharply and followed Bryn along the path. Phoenix tried hard not to feel glad that Jade had criticized the Roman. It bothered him that he was a little jealous of Marcus. The boy had a cool, quietly confident sort of attitude that irritated Phoenix for no reason he could think of, except that it made him feel somehow inadequate. He hated that. He'd started this game so he could feel better about himself, not worse. Unsettled, Phoenix padded along in the rear, trying to work out what was annoying him. Finally, he realized he wanted some action again, not all this walking. A short while later, they stopped for a brief rest. Drinking from water skins and nibbling journey bread Jade produced from her pack, they ate in silence. A sense of nervous anticipation pervaded the group and discouraged idle conversation. There were no animal noises, as though the weight of expectation muffled all sound. The sensation of being watched grew again. Around them, the forest seemed to close in. Trees were larger, the canopy denser. Phoenix kept catching flickers of movement at the edge of his vision, only to see nothing when he turned his head. At last, none of them could stand it any longer. Bryn was the first to jump to his feet, ready to continue. In hushed tones, Jade reminded him to be on the lookout for a stream so they could refill their water skins. The boy nodded and waved a hand over his shoulder in acknowledgement as they headed off again. It wasn't long before Bryn and Marcus stepped into a sunny clearing and headed for a small stream meandering through the middle. Phoenix and Jade joined them, blinking and half-blinded in the light after hours in the shade. "Take them!" A hoarse shout rang out. All 4 dropped their water skins and snatched at weapons. Phoenix stood beside Jade and faced their enemies, his heart racing at the thought of battle. Marcus had an arrow in his bow so fast it looked like magic. Bryn held his sling at the ready, eyes darting around the clearing. 8 Roman soldiers stepped into the sunlight, surrounding them on 3 sides, swords drawn and faces wary. A 9th man joined them. He wore a short red cloak flung back over one shoulder and carried a staff in his right hand. His armor was of chainmail, and his helm bore a crest of stiff red horsehair. He was obviously an officer. Phoenix glanced at Marcus, wondering if it was his father, but the boy kept his weapon ready and didn't speak. If anything, his face was even more calm and set than usual. Phoenix tossed up his options and decided to try and settle things peacefully. Action was all well and good, but his Aikido sensei would be horrified if he didn't at least try to talk his way out of it. "We are travelers. We've done nothing wrong. You're making a mistake." He tried to sound confident. hoping it was true. The Roman leader smiled knowingly. "I think not. Governor Agricola himself is after this lad." He pointed with his sword at Marcus. Phoenix suppressed a groan. He knew it had been a mistake to include Marcus. The officer pointed at him. "You, I believe, are wanted for killing a Roman soldier yesterday and for murdering 4 villagers last night. And of course," the officer added softly, "the governor will pay handsomely for you." He indicated Jade with his sword and smirked. "A good catch, I'd say. Now put down your weapons and let's go." There was a soft twang. Marcus's arrow flew from his fingers. It embedded deeply in the right shoulder of the officer, just where the armor was weakest. The officer swore, shouting for his men to advance. Marcus's hands blurred as he notched and shot arrow after arrow with deadly accuracy. One by one, soldiers fell back, clutching at shafts protruding from their bodies. A loud clang and a groan told Phoenix that Bryn had entered the fray and was gleefully slinging rocks at the enemy. Although every instinct screamed at him to jump into battle, Phoenix had to wait until the soldiers were closer before he could fight. There was no point getting in the way of Marcus's arrows. The Roman was doing a pretty good job of holding the soldiers back on his own. Even as that thought crossed his mind, Phoenix spotted movement in the forest. He heard Marcus shout a warning, and Bryn groan in despair. 16 more soldiers stepped into the clearing. They held up long, curved rectangular shields, making them almost invulnerable to arrows and stones alike. Marcus dropped his bow and yanked out his sword. Bryn pulled out his little knife, looking frightened, but determined. Jade held her quarterstaff ready before her, white-knuckled. Phoenix renewed his grip on his sword and grinned fiercely. Here it came. With angry mutterings, the Romans advanced step by step toward the 4. Several of the soldiers Marcus had injured were back on their feet and had joined their comrades. 4 lay sprawled, lifeless on the ground. The officer was no longer smiling. They meant business. The closest soldier reached Phoenix and jabbed at him with his gladius. Phoenix parried awkwardly and stepped aside. Again, he experienced that frightening moment of total confusion as his 2 selves tried to react in their own fighting styles. Again, his real-world self reacted with Aikido, turning, blocking, redirecting. His warrior self from this world tried to chop and slice. This time, it was worse. It paralyzed him, froze his mind and body with conflicting messages. It would get him killed. A second soldier closed, and a third. Phoenix stopped thinking. He deliberately blocked out his 13-year-old mind and let his sword-fighting memories flood in. Those muscle memories were stronger in this form. It was his only hope. His body, trained and ready, reacted faster than he could think anyway. He spun, lashed out, connected with a sickening sound, danced out of the way, spun again, parried, and jumped back. His dagger was now in his left hand, ready to stab or deflect blows. There was no time to unsling the shield from his back. Another clang of sword on sword, a slash underneath, into unprotected ribs. He backed away again, breathing hard, trying to block out the screams of the wounded. 3 men down. Fighting against the Romans was unlike fighting the untrained peasants or the native bandit warriors of this land. The Romans used a sword designed for both hacking and thrusting. Phoenix's sword and style were based on chopping. He found it hard to avoid and block the quick jabbing thrusts. More soldiers approached. The only thing the Phoenix and his friends had to their advantage was that the men couldn't come at them in large groups without hitting each other. He risked a quick glance and saw 2 soldiers at Marcus's feet, groaning. 3 were unconscious near Jade, either from her quarterstaff or from Bryn's darting knife. It was hard to tell. Her staff dealt multiple resounding blows on any man stupid enough to come within reach. He'd looked away too long and barely managed to avoid being skewered through the stomach. The blade grazed his hip and he yelled in pain and shock. Anger flowed through him, giving him new power. He was strong. He could beat these idiots easily. There was no way he was going to be defeated on level 1. Twist, cut, turn, parry, stab, slice. 2 more Romans down, but still more came on. Phoenix's breath rasped fast and hard in his throat. He gave ground under a furious assault by 2 determined soldiers. His little group was slowly but surely pushed back until they were almost standing in the small stream. The ground was slippery with mud and moss. It grew harder to keep his footing and there was less room to maneuver. A shrill scream rent the air. Phoenix risked a glance back to see Bryn held tightly by the Roman officer. The boy bit and kicked for all he was worth, but Phoenix could see it was no good. The Roman produced a dagger and held it to Bryn's throat. "Put down your weapons or I'll kill him," the officer shouted above the melee. Helpless frustration replaced anger in Phoenix's veins, turning his resolve to despair. They couldn't lose the game so soon. It just wasn't fair. For a brief instant, he considered letting the officer simply kill Bryn. After all, Bryn and the officer were both just digital constructs in the game. But he couldn't. Not only did it go completely against his nature and training, but what if the cloaked old woman was right, and this world was real in some way? Then wasn't Bryn real as well? With a growl of confusion and annoyance, Phoenix lowered his sword. Immediately, 3 soldiers placed the tips of theirs at his throat. The same happened to Marcus and Jade when they followed his lead. The officer smiled thinly and relaxed his grip on Bryn. Holding the boy by the elbow, he shouldered his way through the soldiers. Phoenix looked bleakly at him through half-closed eyes, wondering what would happen now. He supposed their group would be split up. Marcus would be dragged back to his father, Bryn sold into slavery, Jade tortured and unkilled, and himself forcibly recruited into the Roman army, at least. There seemed to be nothing he could do about it, but there had to be something. The game just couldn't end here. There had to be a way to win. At the thought, he noticed warmth on his chest. The amulet. It was heating up again. What could it mean? He couldn't risk looking down at it. There were still 3 swords at his throat. Just beside him, he heard Jade's voice murmuring something in Elvish. The Roman officer looked startled, then frightened at the sound. He switched his knife point from Bryn's throat to hers. "Shut up, woman, or I'll shut you up permanently," he threatened. From the corner of his eye, Phoenix saw Jade gulp. She had raised her hands when a soldier had taken her staff. They were held at about shoulder height, palms out to show she was weaponless. She'd stopped speaking, but her fingertips seemed to have a faint purplish haze about them. Hope surged. Did she have a trick up her sleeve that could get them out of this helpless situation? He tensed every muscle, waiting for a chance to act if she did. To Chapter 10. Sneeze. Phoenix stared at Jade in disbelief. He couldn't decide whether to laugh or slap her back in congratulations. "You've got this cool magic to use, and you get your enemies to sneeze?" All around them, Roman soldiers convulsed and fell over, unable to keep their feet or see straight. Well, Jade sent him a hurt look. It worked, didn't it? She waved a hand around the clearing, indicating the 20 or so soldiers collapsing as wave after wave of sneezes shook them. Phoenix gazed at them, then gave way to the relieved laughter bubbling inside him. Jade's frown changed to a reluctant smile. Marcus and Bryn exchanged amazed looks. Then Bryn, too, howled with laughter. Marcus permitted himself a small smile, though his eyes were troubled. It took several seconds before they were in control enough to gather their weapons and gear again, ignoring the Centurion officer, who staggered after them, swearing, sneezing, and feebly waving his sword. The four companions filled their water skins at the stream and wove their way through the shuddering soldiers toward the other side of the clearing. A final glance showed them men who looked truly miserable. They certainly weren't capable to retaking their prisoners. Still chuckling, Phoenix wiped his eyes. He noticed Bryn snatch up a woven bag one of the soldiers had dropped at the edge of the clearing. Catching the boy's bold gaze, Phoenix frowned, then shrugged. It might contain something useful, and they could use all the help they could get at this point. Bryn grinned and flipped the sack over his shoulder with a jaunty whistle. A sharp pain in his side made Phoenix wince. He touched his hip gingerly and felt a shallow slice there, bleeding sluggishly. There wasn't much he could do now. They had to get back into the forest and away from these soldiers. Gritting his teeth, he followed the others. "Let's get out of here before it wears off," he ordered, limping into line behind Jade. The sounds of wild sneezing faded, and the group became more serious again as the gloom deepened beneath the green canopy. "So how long does that spell last?" he asked her. "About an hour," she shrugged. Phoenix grunted and nodded to Bryn to pick up the pace a bit. They had to get somewhere safe for the night before the soldiers found their trail again. The cover of darkness was still a few hours away. Why not something a bit more permanent, like disappear, or die, or explode? Phoenix gave voice to the question that had been nagging him for the last 10 minutes. Marcus nodded, and Bryn dropped back to listen, obviously wanting to know the answer as well. Jade, who seemed to have been lost in thought, frowned at him before answering. "It has to be a single-word imperative verb that they are capable of performing," she replied at last. He blinked at her. "In stupid people speak, please." "Oh, sorry. I was thinking of something else. The spell is limited," she explained. "You can only use one word, and it has to be in order to do something. But it has to be something they are actually able to do." She raised her eyebrows at Phoenix, who nodded doubtfully. "You can't order someone to explode because they're not physically capable to doing that. So I'd pour all my energy into the spell, and it would just suck me dry trying to achieve what I'd asked. The person wouldn't explode, but I'd die." "Ah," Phoenix said, understanding. "So you've got a few more useful words up your sleeve, I hope. I mean," he added wryly, "sneezing people isn't exactly the most awe-inspiring way of defeating our enemies." Jade pursed her lips. "It was all I could think of at the time. I'd be happy to hear any better suggestions. Anyway," there was a hint of hurt in her voice again, "my sister gets hay fever with massive sneezing fits. She says it's like your brains explode out through your nose and get replaced by snot. She can't think clearly all day. I'm sure it will keep the soldiers off our trail for, long enough." Apparently satisfied that she'd explained herself, she glanced around the forest with a frown. "Can you guys hear something? Like a voice? Whispering?" When the others shook their heads, she frowned again and chewed on her lip, clearly sinking back into whatever had been preoccupying her before. Phoenix exchanged rueful glances with Bryn and gestured for him to continue leading the way. They walked well into the evening without stopping again to eat or rest. Twice, Bryn led them up streams to cover their tracks, and once they hopped for several hundred meters across an area of exposed boulders and logs. At one point, they came to a fork in the path. Both ways were indistinct. Bryn hesitated. "Go right," Jade said, her voice and expression somewhat dreamy. You sure? Phoenix glanced around. The forest looked the same in both directions, but as far as he could tell, going right would take them more north than west. It would also lead further into the deep woods, further into fair folk territory. Somehow they'd been lucky enough to pass unnoticed through their land so far. Was it worth pushing their luck? Jade blinked slowly at him, then shook her head as though to free it of fog. She was her normal self when she replied, "We'll be safe. We're being watched, but we won't be harmed." "How do you know?" He gripped his sword, not liking the thought that they were still being watched. She hesitated, then shrugged. "I just do. You'll have to trust me on this one." Unsatisfactory as that answer was, Phoenix had to accept it. She was, after all, an elf, attuned to all things natural. If this was a forest folk haven, it made sense that her character would feel bound to it. Still, it made him uneasy. In the end, it was so dark that they all had to rely on Jade's night vision to guide them. It annoyed Phoenix to feel so dependent on anyone, but they needed to put some distance between them and the Romans before they could camp for the night. Finally, she stopped and told them to wait. Phoenix stood in the gloom with Marcus and Bryn, feeling stupid. When she whispered in his ear, he almost yelled in shock. "There's a small cave just a little way up this hill. It's off the path and hidden behind a stand of trees. We should be able to light a fire." She took his hand. He groped for Bryn, and the boys snatched Marcus's hand. Jade guided them through the blackness, murmuring soft instructions about where to put their feet. When they reached the cave, Phoenix dropped his pack and shield with relief. Jade and Bryn gathered wood near the cave entrance and quickly started a small fire, well hidden by piled-up rocks and a thicket of trees outside. Marcus began to gut and pluck the pheasant he had caught. Phoenix started skinning the hare, although he had to suppress the urge to chuck. Luckily, his character knew how to do this stuff, because he'd certainly never had to do anything like it in the real world. Chopping up dead animals was the last thing he wanted to do. His hip ached, and so did his sword arm. They were all exhausted, but he refused to be the one to admit it. Technically, he was older and stronger than all the others. If they could keep going, so could he. Bryn tended the fire as Marcus added bits of meat into a pot of boiling water. Jade tossed in some wild onion and herbs, and the stew began to smell appetizing. Phoenix finished cleaning and butchering the hare and pigeons. After a moment's thought, he rigged a drying rack above the fire and hung the strips of meat up. With luck, in the morning they would be smoked enough to keep the next day. He could finish cooking them the next night. At last, he sat back down and stared blankly into the leaping flames. Listening to Jade bemoan their lack of bowls and spoons, Phoenix was reminded of the woven bag Bryn had collected from the soldiers. Maybe there were spoons in it, or maybe treasure. "Let's see what we have here, then." He picked up the bag and tipped it out on the dirt floor. Bryn protested that it was his bag, but subsided when Phoenix glared at him. There wasn't all that much of interest as far as he could tell, anyway. There were 2 spoons and 2 small wooden bowls, a loaf of flat bread, a little sack of dried leaves, a coil of thin rope, and another bag, made of some shiny black material. Jade pounced on the bowls, then examined the dried leaves, declaring them to be bay leaves, native to Greece. She put one into the stew and tucked the rest into her backpack for use in seasoning food. The bread went into their food stores. She passed the rope to Marcus. He wrapped it around his waist like a belt, saying it might be useful sometime. Phoenix picked up the black bag and turned it over in his hands. It only weighed a few ounces and felt slippery, cool, and decidedly empty. The bag itself wasn't huge, but the drawstring mouth seemed enormous, and the red cords holding it shut were very long. It looked as though the bag could be opened right up to lay flat on the ground. Curious, he tried it. He tugged the mouth open as far as it would go, then spread it out on the ground. Sure enough, it formed an almost perfect circle about a meter across. He reached out to smooth the black material flat, but Bryn snatched at his hand. "Don't touch it," the boy exclaimed, wide-eyed with wonder. "Why? Do you know what it is?" Phoenix drew his hand back. "I think it's a Hylian Bagia," Bryn breathed. "A magic bag made of cave spider silk. They're really, really rare, and really, really valuable." His eyes sparkled with interest and a hint of fear. "That doesn't help me much," Phoenix grumbled. He searched his character's memories, but his warrior hadn't come into contact with much magic in his short life. The ancient Brittonic words, Hylian Bagia, translated literally as all-eye bag, which didn't make a great deal of sense. Frowning, he tried to remember what little he'd read about magical items in the game rulebook, but nothing helpful leapt to mind. He glanced at Marcus, who shook his head to indicate his ignorance. Jade knelt beside Bryn and examined the bag without touching it, her head tilted to one side. "I can kind of see the magic shimmering around it like a sort of purple-blue glow," she said, narrowing her eyes. Phoenix stared at it hard, but it only shimmered when his eyes began to water. "So what does it do?" "Well," Bryn picked up a small stone and held it over the open bag. "This." He dropped the stone onto the black opening. The stone vanished. Jade gasped in shock. Phoenix began to reach out, but yanked his arm back just in time. If the stone had disappeared, what would happen to his arm if he touched the material? "Where did it go?" she breathed. Phoenix reached to her. "Hold my hand. I'm going to find out." "No." Marcus laid a hand on his shoulder. When he turned angrily on the Roman, Marcus just tightened his grip and shook his head. "I'm the least valuable member. Bryn's your guide. Jade's a spellweaver and a woman. You're their leader. I should be the one to try it out." "But," Jade protested. "No, Jade," Marcus said gently. We don't want to risk losing you. Anyone." The Roman boy caught Phoenix's astonished look and turned away, flushing red. Jade looked annoyed, confused, then quietly pleased. "Nobody needs to go," Bryn interrupted. They all looked at him. "It's just a hold-all. You put stuff in and you take it back out again when you need it. It never gets heavier, so you can put as much as you like into it." Phoenix eyed the empty blackness dubiously. "But how do you get it back out again?" Bryn swallowed and bravely reached into the bag. His arm disappeared up to the elbow. Jade choked a warning, and Marcus turned a few shades paler. "Stone," the boy murmured, then withdrew his hand. There in his palm was the small stone he'd cast in moments before. "So you have to name what it is you want before it will come out?" Jade asked. "As far as I've heard, that's the way it works." Bryn nodded. His usual cocky expression was back now he'd shown them how the bag worked without injury. "But what if there's lots of stuff in there already?" Phoenix was troubled. Who knew what the Romans had already stashed in there? Bryn shrugged. "Unless you know what it is, it's staying in there." He screwed up his nose and added, "But I suppose you could guess and fish around a few times. These bags are supposed to be harmless." Phoenix glanced at Marcus. "What do you think the Romans would have stored in here?" Marcus crouched beside him and gazed into the black hole for a long moment. Shaking his head, he replied thoughtfully, "I'm finding it hard to believe they even had one. He stopped, then started again. "They don't really believe in this sort of magic." "What do you mean, this sort of magic?" Jade demanded. "Do they believe in some sort?" Marcus nodded slowly. The gods have a magic of their own. They use it to help or hinder mortals when they feel like interfering in our lives. Romans don't believe in, earth magic or magic items like this. What do you mean by earth magic? Jade asked. The Roman looked uncomfortable, glancing at Jade, then away again. The sort that you practice, using plants and the like. The sort that comes from being close to the land, part of the land, like elves are. He seemed to feel he'd said enough and sat back to tend the stew. Phoenix raised an eyebrow at Jade. Shall we give it a go? Nothing to lose, I suppose, she replied dubiously. Except maybe an arm, quipped Bryn. Phoenix glared. The boy grinned back irrepressibly. Gingerly, Phoenix inserted his right hand into the bag. There was a strange, tingly coldness as his fingers disappeared. He wriggled them and waved his hand around, but encountered nothing. Thinking, he said aloud, "Knife, nothing. Bread, nothing. Helmet, still nothing. Let me try." Jade reached her hand in. Hat, nothing. Shoes, nothing. Cheese. Phoenix stared at her. Cheese. Bryn snickered. She shrugged. Just a thought. He studied the size of the opening, wondering what a Roman would fit through it that might be useful. Mentally, he pictured the Romans as he'd seen them in the clearing. They'd looked pretty much like every picture of Roman soldiers he'd ever seen. Armor made of small plates of metal covering their chests. Metal helmets, short leather and iron skirt things, sandals, short swords, big shields. What was missing? Tripylum, Marcus suggested. What? Phoenix frowned. What's that? A sort of spear the infantry carry, he replied. Yes. Phoenix slapped his own thigh. That's what was missing. He put his hand back in. Pylum. Thump. Something wooden and heavy slammed into his hand. His fingers closed around it automatically, and he drew it out, and out, and out. The spear was so long that he had to turn it, so it pointed out the entrance of the cave before he could get it clear of the bag without hitting the roof. They all stared at the long wooden shaft and the thin metal length and tip attached to it, then back at the small black bag in astonishment. I wonder how many are in there, Jade breathed. There are 80 men in a centuria, Marcus said. It's possible the centurion officer was using the bag to carry the pila for all his men. The other three gazed at him now in bewilderment. You mean there might be 79 more in that little bag? Phoenix said. Marcus looked thoughtful. Personally, I think it would be impractical to have 80 men all trying to get their weapons out of one small bag. It's more likely that he only used it to carry his own possessions, or maybe the javelins of his own contubernium. Seeing their blank looks, he explained. A contubernium is 8 men. A centuria is 10 lots of contubernia. Phoenix did the mental calculation, then shook himself. So, basically, his heart was sinking even as he said it. What you're saying is that we've now got the centurion's personal magic bag, probably full of his own personal items. Probably, Marcus agreed. He thought for a moment, and then added, you could try asking for Roman coins, too. With a portentous feeling, Phoenix plunged his hand back in and said, Roman coins. Instantly, his hand was full of what felt like money. He drew them out and dribbled the silver coins onto the ground. Bryn pounced on them. Marcus picked one up and nodded. Roman coins. Denarii, he confirmed. Either the centurion's own hoard or the pay for his men. Well, I did forget to bring any with me. Phoenix grinned at Jade. Oh no. Jade stared at the little pile of coins Bryn was counting. We've beaten their soldiers, stolen their money, and they know about Marcus and I. She bit her lip. I'm afraid we've just given 80 soldiers a really good reason to keep chasing us." Marcus grimaced. "I hate to say it, but it's not going to be just one centuria of 80 men anymore. They don't like to be humiliated. It's more likely to be the entire cohort they belong to." He returned their horrified stares stoically. 480 soldiers will be after us now. Chapter 11. Nobody but Bryn got much sleep that night. After they ate, they put the javelin, most of the money plus a few of their own things, into the Hylian Bagia. Jade tended to their various, luckily slight, injuries. Then they briefly discussed their travel plans for the next day, but as that primarily consisted of more walking through the forest and avoiding the Romans, there really wasn't much to say. So Marcus added a little wood to the fire, and Jade took first watch, while the rest settled down to sleep as best they could. Phoenix found that the slightest noise outside the cave brought everyone except Bryn full wakefulness each time. The youngster slept blissfully on until Phoenix woke him for last watch. Their skittishness was wasted. The half-expected horde of Romans did not appear. Day dawned, and with it came a change in weather. Clear weather was replaced by a constant, chilly drizzle that soaked through the thickest cloak. Overcast skies meant the weary adventurers slept later than they should have. It was well past dawn when they emerged from the cave, ready to move. Following Bryn, they returned to the trail. Rain dripped ceaselessly from shiny leaves. Underfoot, wet leaves and mud stuck to their boots, sandals, and bare feet. They were leaving a clear trail, but it was difficult not to. The air was cool enough that their noses turned red, and their fingers stiffened with cold. They ate as they walked. Breakfast was a sketchy affair of bread and a few pieces of hare and pheasant meat from the night before. Phoenix chewed the cold fare, disliking it but wishing there were more. What he would give for a hot plate of bacon and eggs and toast right now. Or even a carrot. Not broccoli, though. Not even a year in this time would make him want broccoli. He wondered if they even had carrots and broccoli in ancient England. Jade would probably know. He'd now been gone 3 nights and 2 days. This was the 3rd. It seemed like much longer. Some of the initial excitement of being in the game had worn off. They were still several days away from Stonehenge, and each moment they delayed made it more likely that the Romans would get the jewel first. He wasn't yet ready to face the possibility that they may not actually make it at all. This world was still a heck of a lot more interesting than his own, but he was beginning to miss a few things about home. Toilet paper and soft beds being high on the list. "Do you think we'll make it home?" Phoenix started and looked quickly around. Jade walked next to him, looking miserable and wet. "What?" He wasn't certain he'd heard her words and not just his own thoughts. "I said, do you think we'll make it home?" she repeated softly. Shrugging, he jammed his hands under his cloak. "Sure, if we can beat the Romans to the jewel." "I miss my family," she said forlornly. "This is a lot harder than I expected. I'm scared we won't even make it through level 1. For some reason, her low mood annoyed Phoenix. It coincided too closely with the niggling doubts he was trying hard to ignore. "Don't be stupid." He spoke more harshly than he intended. "Of course we'll get home. Get. Besides," he added, "I thought you were starting to like it here." Looking at Marcus's broad back ahead of them, he added, "Or at least like some of the people here." Jade's pale face flushed, and she wrapped her cloak about her body. She sent him a quick, hurt look before hurrying ahead to walk beside Marcus. Phoenix mentally kicked himself. He hadn't meant to take out his own bad mood on Jade. He was just as unsure as she was, but he felt like he wasn't allowed to show it. It felt like the success of this mission rested totally on his shoulders. It was too much. He had no idea how they were supposed to keep avoiding the Romans, no idea how to find the Jewel of Asgard, and no idea how to steal it, even if they could find it. This was a lot harder when you were actually in the game, as opposed to just watching it on a flat screen. Now he was responsible not just for his life, but for 3 other people's as well. It was fine for him to say that, logically, Marcus and Bryn were not real people. What if they were real? They felt real. He was sure that if they got injured or killed, it would hurt to see just as much as if they were. He let out an angry, wordless growl and ripped a small branch off a tree. Hurling it into the undergrowth, he waved away the questioning looks of the others and kept walking. He didn't want to be responsible for anyone else. He didn't want to even think about it. This was a game. It was meant to be fun. He just wanted some good fights and a bit of a lark. He didn't want it to be real. Reality sucked. Jade strode ahead, hurt by Phoenix's unfair comments. Whatever was bugging Phoenix, he had no right to take it out on her. They were all tired and worried. She brushed away tears and sniffed defiantly. She would not cry. Being the youngest of 7 had long ago taught her that sulking didn't do any good. Nobody paid attention, so Jade deliberately pushed her hurt feelings aside. She caught up with Marcus. Stealing a quick look up at his handsome profile, she found herself thinking about Phoenix's comment. Did she like Marcus? Is something bothering you? She looked up at him, startled. Had he been somehow reading her mind? No, he was referring to her spat with Phoenix. Oh, she tried to sound relaxed. I didn't sleep well. Kept thinking I heard someone calling my name, and Phoenix is just being grumpy. What did he say to you? Jade opened her mouth, then blushed. Nothing important, she finished lamely. Can I ask you something? It seems safer to change the subject. Marcus nodded. Why did you pull a knife out when I woke you yesterday morning? Were you expecting to be killed in your sleep? She asked jokingly. Marcus stared at her gravely for so long that Jade felt the smile slip off her face. Appalled, she realized what his silence meant. You mean you were expecting us to murder you? Jade wasn't sure how to feel about that. Kind of sickened and a little upset. Marcus made a gesture as if to brush away her words. No, not you, he assured her, but then added, it's just a habit. You have a habit of expecting people to kill you in your sleep? That was even more astonishing, if possible. What sort of family do you have? Jade was outraged on his behalf. The Roman stared silently ahead for a few moments, his eyes on the path before them. Just when Jade thought he wasn't going to answer, he spoke. My father's a soldier. You learn to expect violent death when you're brought up in a military family. Your father's death may be, she scoffed, but surely not your own. You're just a key. She broke off, thinking about her history lessons. In olden times, when people didn't live very long, someone Marcus's age would be considered a man, not a kid. It was only in modern times that teenagers were thought to be too young for responsibility and treated like children. Marcus, by ancient Roman standards, was an adult. It was a sobering thought. He was probably the most qualified of any of them to lead this expedition. But Phoenix seemed to resent him. Jade was aware that Phoenix didn't quite trust Marcus, but she did. She knew the Roman was hiding something, but he had no evil intentions toward them. She could tell that instinctively. Anyway, they all had something to hide. I'm old enough to join the Legion. Marcus jerked his chin up. Jade laid her hand on his arm and caught his affronted gaze. I'm sorry. That was rude. She eyed him, remembering something else. I've been meaning to say thank you for helping us. When he looked surprised, she continued. You fought against your own countrymen yesterday. Must have been difficult for you. You barely know us and you've probably grown up with some of them, so thank you." Marcus touched her fingers lightly, then dropped his arm away and grimaced. It was no hardship to fight against that Centuria. It's well known their Centurion reports directly to Feng Judai. Jade stopped in the middle of the path, her mouth open in shock. Phoenix, who had been walking close behind, plowed into her, sending them both stumbling. He apologized, but Jade barely heard him. She grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his arm. "Marcus, say that again, about the Centurion we fought yesterday. Tell Phoenix." Phoenix looked back and forth between the two of them, clearly confused. Marcus raised his eyebrows but repeated what he'd said. "I said that I didn't mind shooting the officer we fought yesterday, since he's in league with the governor's chief advisor, Feng Judai." Phoenix took an involuntary step back as he heard the name. Jade met his startled look and didn't protest when he dragged her off to one side and hissed in her ear. "But this is only level 1. What's the big bad guy doing here? He's supposed to be with the Emperor Han Zhangdi and General Ban Chao in China, not with Governor Agricola of Roman Britain. I thought we wouldn't have to defeat him until level 5. "I don't know," she replied in an undertone. "I was hoping you might. Didn't you say you'd read the rulebook? I only skimmed the startup information." She watched him rub his forehead as if he could squeeze the information out of his head. He shook himself. "I'm not certain of anything anymore," he admitted. "But I am sure the goal of the game is to ultimately defeat Judai in the last level of the game, not the first. Here, we just have to focus on getting the jewel before the Romans do, so we can get to level 2. "Get home," she corrected. Phoenix shrugged. "Whatever. Hey," he raised excited eyes to hers. "Maybe if we kill Judai now, we can finish it here on this level and you'll get home sooner." He must have read the doubt on her face, for he quickly added, "It's worth a try, isn't it?" "I don't know," she murmured. "Judai is supposed to be some sort of super wizard. Well, maybe in this level he's not so tough." He wrapped his fingers lovingly around the hilt of his sword. "The only problem is," she nibbled at her lower lip, trying hard to ignore a rising wave of panic, "we're not so tough in this level either." "True." His agreement seemed reluctant. "So maybe you'd better talk to Marcus and find out all he knows about Judai. It is a bit annoying that he's here." "Annoying?" Jade blinked at him. "That's an understatement and a half." She signaled Bryn to keep walking and turned back to Marcus. "So tell me about the governor's advisor. How long has he been in that position? What's he like? Where's he from?" Marcus frowned. "There's little to tell." He spread his hands wide. "He arrived from Rome a year ago, sent by Caesar himself to help the governor subdue the Celtic tribes. He's from some distant land that I know." "How do you know?" she demanded. Marcus's dark eyes turned thoughtful. "Judai is a man like no other I've seen. His eyes are black and narrow and kind of..." He put his fingers at the corners of his own eyes and pulled them sideways. Jade nodded. "He's Chinese." "Chinese?" She tried to remember what or if the Romans had ever traded with the Chinese in 80 AD. She couldn't recall, so she just flapped her hands for him to go on. "Never mind. Just tell me everything you know about him, like how he helps the governor. Is he just giving the governor advice on battle tactics?" "What?" So Marcus talked, and Jade listened, with Phoenix edging ever closer to try and hear too. Feng Judai had arrived from nowhere a year before to advise Agricola on how to handle the rebellious Celtic tribes who were stubbornly resisting Roman rule throughout Britain. However, the methods he advised were less than honorable, and many soldiers were beginning to resent the influence this foreigner had over their governor. Marcus spoke darkly of mass slaughters of druids and disappearances of both local people and soldiers who had spoken out against Judai. There was apparently a newly constructed stone temple of sorts in Londinium that was solely for his use. People went in and never came out. Marcus described him as cold and somehow all-knowing. It was said that he could read the minds of anyone brought before him. There was even one story of a man who, after being touched on the head by the chief advisor, died moments later in hideous agony, but without a single mark on his body. Jade listened in growing horror, occasionally breaking in with a question, but somehow not doubting Marcus's tale at all. After all, Feng Judai had been programmed to be the arch-nemesis of the 88 game. It made sense that he would be extremely powerful and totally ruthless. Unfortunately, knowing he'd just been written to be evil didn't make her feel any better. Marcus fell silent at last. "And the governor?" she prompted. "Is he under some sort of spell, or does he really trust Judai?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "The governor trusts no one, but," he paused, looking thoughtful, "I suppose it is possible that Judai could have some sort of arcane influence over him. That could explain why." He broke off, fingering a long, still pink scar on his forearm. "It doesn't matter. The point is that Judai is somehow controlling Governor Agricola. I would give a lot to put an end to that situation. Before he arrived, the governor was at least willing to listen to reason about his treatment of the Bretons and the fairy folk. It was only after Judai arrived that the governor ordered the persecution of your kind and the wholesale slaughter of druids, Bretons, and Celts." The Roman lifted his head and gazed at Jade, his mouth pressed into a tight line. "I must tell you that my presence is severely endangering your life." Jade frowned, but shook her head. "It's all right. We know the soldiers want you back, but you're the son of a soldier, so I doubt they'll actually try to kill us while you're with us. So really, you're probably keeping us safe." "No." He shook his head. "It's not just because of who I am. The Romans are after me because I attempted to assassinate Feng Judai. The governor is furious with me." Marcus looked straightly at Jade. "Since we saw that centurion, I've known he has sent Judai himself to find me. The governor wants me back, it's true, but Judai wants me dead." Chapter 12. "Oh no," Jade groaned. She sank down onto a log and dropped her head into her hands with a sigh. "So now we've got Judai after us already, as well as half the Roman army? This is not what I was expecting when I started this." Marcus crouched before her, his eyes troubled by her worry. "I'm sorry. I have placed you all in greater danger. I should leave." "No." Jade grabbed his arm. "Don't go. I'm just overreacting. We'll cope." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She blushed and released him. Her heart thudded uncomfortably as he stood up and faced Phoenix. "What about you? Do I stay with you or go?" the Roman boy asked with quiet pride. "I know you have some mission to achieve, and I don't want to jeopardize that or your lives with my presence. It's your decision." Jade jumped to her feet. "It's all of our decision, not just Phoenix's. We're in this together." She stared defiantly at the two warriors, annoyed at Marcus's automatic assumption that Phoenix was leader, just because he was a man. Biting her lip, she looked at Phoenix. "But I don't think Bryn and Marcus can make a decision without knowing more. We need to tell them." Phoenix stared at her, obviously caught off guard. "Tell them what exactly?" "I think if we tell them what our ultimate aim is, then Marcus and Bryn can decide for themselves if they want to help or not," she said uncertainly. "It's not fair to drag them around the countryside without knowing what they're getting into. Sounds like great advice to me, Bryn encouraged. I always like to know what I'm getting myself into, especially if it involves being killed by 480 Roman soldiers and a mad foreign wizard. He held up his hands in surrender when Phoenix scowled at him. Hey, he said, I only signed on to guide you to Carrega Amgarn and maybe help you steal the Jewel of Asgard and nab some treasure for myself. If there's more to this, it'd be nice to know now. Fine then. Phoenix scrubbed a hand over his face, as though the last 3 days had finally caught up to him. Jade could almost feel his exhaustion and impatience. He just wanted to get on with it. He obviously thought she was making things more complicated than they needed to be. We're here on a great quest. He seemed to be struggling to put it into words. Jade kept quiet with an effort as he continued. We have to complete 5 quests in 5 different parts of the world. The first is to get the jewel from the druids at Carrega Amgarn, as you mentioned, Bryn. If we manage that and the other 4 Lev quests, then we should be able to achieve our ultimate goal, to kill Feng Judai. Bryn's jaw dropped. Marcus frowned. Jade watched them both anxiously. But such tasks could take years, Marcus noted. It takes many weeks to get just from here to Rome. Why should you have to travel all around the world to defeat Judai when he is already here? Well, I'm fairly sure we won't have to travel overland to get to our next destination, the Phoenix stopped, glanced at Jade, then began again. Jade has a way of getting us to the next place, by magic. There are only 3 of you. Marcus glanced at each in turn. How are 1 warrior, a boy, and a mere woman going to defeat Feng Judai? Hey! Bryn scowled back, and Jade had to press her lips firmly together to stop herself from echoing his outrage. Mere woman, indeed. Marcus flushed and bowed toward them. I apologize. In Roman society, children and women are not expected to go into battle. Please remember, I have seen what Feng Judai can do, and although you are both skilled, you cannot defeat him. Phoenix grimaced. To be honest, we weren't expecting him to be here. We are supposed to complete 4 other tasks before even meeting him. Doing the other tasks is meant to give us enough skills and strength to face him and have a chance of killing him. So you're saying that if you meet him in battle now, you will lose, Marcus stated. Phoenix shrugged. Jade nodded. Probably. There was a long silence as the 4 companions thought and waited. So what do you want to do? Jade finally asked. We'd totally understand if you decided it was too risky to travel with us. She laid a hand on Bryn's shoulder and smiled down at him. You can just take some of that money and go, if you want. The boy gave a one-shouldered shrug. I've got nothing more to lose. Judai himself ordered my family's execution. His young face was grim. I'd be perfectly happy to spend months or years if we could kill him in the end. I'm with you all the way. Besides, he added slyly, I've always wanted to travel. Jade opened her eyes wide and exchanged a shocked look with Phoenix. She glanced at Marcus, wondering how he would take this latest revelation. Marcus's air of hesitation left him. He straightened up, took a firm grip on the hilt of his sword, and pulled it from its sheath. Kneeling on the damp earth in front of Jade and Phoenix, he laid his sword at their feet and bowed his head. I swear fealty to you both. He looked up into their eyes, his expression earnest and determined. My sword is yours. My life is yours. I will do anything in my power to help you achieve your goal, for it is mine also. Phoenix put a hand on his shoulder. There's no need for that, Marcus. We aren't your masters. We're your friends. Marcus stood and sheathed his sword. He bowed. Thank you for your trust. I know it wasn't easy to give. Still, he added, I'm sure you would feel better if you allowed me to swear an oath. Or if we all took an oath to each other, perhaps. Phoenix looked at Jade. She grimaced and glanced around. Inspiration hit, and she dashed a few steps off the path, returning moments later with her hands full of vines. Everyone put your left hand into the middle, palm upwards, she ordered. If you're truly willing to be part of this group, that is. You don't have to. But after a moment's hesitation, they all did so. Using her right hand, Jade twined the vine around and around all of their arms, binding them loosely together in a green and flesh knot. Tucking the ends in, she instructed them all to lay their hands atop each other's, palm up. Then she fussed for a second, arranging their hands so that each palm was squarely on top of the last, in a stack of hands. Phoenix's on the bottom, hers on the top. Next, she picked up a small amount of mud from the wet, puddled path and rubbed it into the middle of her palm. Jade? Phoenix asked, looking like he thought she was insane. Nothing was happening except that they all looked very silly, with a vine wrapped around their wrists. Hang on. She frowned at him. Okay. Now everyone stare right at the middle of my hand, and don't look away until I tell you, she instructed. They did so. Jade began to murmur, soft elvish words that she knew made no sense to the others. Her voice rose and fell in a hypnotic chant, a song that entwined them in the lazy warmth of summer, the blazing colors of autumn, the frost-white chill of winter, and the green newness of spring, all intertwined at once. Somehow, the scents of cut hay and ripe berries, new snow and fresh green peas teased their noses. The sounds of birds singing filled their ears, then faded away only to swell again in different songs. On Jade's chest, her amulet glowed. The vine twisted about their limbs, began to pulsate and glow a rich, dark green. Jade pointed a finger, and a small green flame appeared, dancing just above her palm. The vine seemed to slide down their arms, toward the flame. Weirdly, it wasn't getting tighter. In fact, it seemed to be disappearing somewhere. Somehow it was being absorbed into the flame at the center of Jade's hand. There was a green, sort of fuzzy look about their hands now. She finished the spell, and the green mist vanished with her words. The others stared at their hands. The vine was completely gone. They glanced at Jade, and she nodded, drawing her hand back and inspecting it. Phoenix and the others did the same. There was no green mark, no sign of the vine or the mud. Their hands were perfectly clean, apart from the grime acquired while traveling, fighting, and not bathing. What exactly was that? Phoenix asked her, sounding like he wasn't sure he actually wanted to know. Well, she blinked at him. A binding spell. She swayed on her feet, feeling lightheaded. Marcus put a hand under her arm to steady her. Phoenix paused, still staring at his hand. And that is? It just means that we four are bound together until the end of our mutual quest, she explained, sinking back onto the log with a sigh of relief. It's like an oath, but a bit deeper. It means that we are sword companions, oath brothers and sisters, unbreakably bound by the powers of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. We will do all we can to aid each other. If one of us is in trouble, the others will know it. If one is lost, I should be able to sense what direction to go to find him. She looked at them each in turn, as the depth of this bond sank in. Only treachery or death can break this spell. If it's broken, you'll get a sharp pain in the hand, and the vine will reappear around mine. There was a long silence while the others stared at her and digested the implications of the binding spell. Bryn looked at Jade with something akin to hero worship in his big brown eyes. Marcus rubbed his thumb across the palm of his hand and shuddered in superstitious reaction. Phoenix shook himself, as though trying to rid himself of the clinging sensations of her magic. Okay, then. Well, he clapped Bryn on the shoulder. Let's get on with it, shall we? Lead on, O faithful guide. In his sleep, thousands of kilometers away, Long Bayou smiled. The purple-blue shimmering aura of magic around him brightened. Strength pulsed faintly in his cold, curled body. Charon. With a new sense of unity, Phoenix, Jade, Bryn, and Marcus walked on in damp silence for 3 hours in a roughly southwesterly direction. Nothing stirred in the sodden forest around them, and the rain showed no sign of letting up. Phoenix began to consider where they would sleep and how they would find and cook food. He carried the 2 small pigeons, half-smoked above last night's fire. It would be a meager supper if that were all they had to eat tonight. His stomach was already rumbling audibly. "Bryn," he called out. The boy stopped and looked back, brows raised. He had an endearing smear of mud across one cheek and the beginnings of dark circles beneath his bright eyes. Phoenix glanced at Jade and saw she, too, was starting to look tired. She kept staring around at the trees as though she was looking for something or someone. Marcus's mouth was set in a grim, straight line. They needed to rest and plan. "How far do we go today?" he asked Bryn. The boy narrowed his eyes and looked down the faint path that wound between huge oaks ahead. "Maybe another 2 hours at most?" He sounded uncertain. "We went by the main road with my brother, so it's hard to know exactly how far away we are. But where are we headed? It'd be nice to stay somewhere warm and dry tonight," Phoenix added. "I don't like our luck hunting or finding dry firewood tonight in this weather." "I'd mind to reach the next village tonight," Bryn agreed. "We can't stay in a tavern with you two." He jerked a thumb at Jade and Marcus. "But I've a maternal aunt who'd be willing to house us for fair pay." "She wouldn't betray us to the soldiers?" Marcus asked sharply. Bryn cast him a scornful glance. "Nay, she'd not. She knows what happened to my family, and she'd not turn me over to the invaders for anything. I know my kin." "I'm sorry," the Roman murmured, flushing. "Okay," Phoenix agreed. "We can make it that far, can't we?" He sent a sidelong glance at Jade. She nodded but closed her eyes briefly. He got the impression that the magic she'd performed had taken a lot out of her. He made a quick decision. "First, we need to find somewhere dry to rest for a few minutes and eat something. We're all tired, and if we keep pushing ourselves, someone will injure themselves. Or worse, we won't be able to defend ourselves against unexpected enemies." "What about there?" Marcus put in, pointing a little off to the right of the path. They all squinted through the drizzle. Jade gasped, her face alight. He was pointing at a massive oak tree about 50 meters away. Its branches spread to shade the ground, even up to where they stood. Its trunk was so thick that 10 people could have stood, arms stretched with fingertips touching, and still not encompassed it. A million tiny new green leaves were showing on every branch and twig. It was a thing of beauty. There was a narrow, dark breach in one side, only just wide enough to admit a man's shoulders. "Perfect," Jade breathed. "So that's what I've been hearing. I knew she had to be around here somewhere." "It's just a big hollow tree, isn't it?" Bryn asked, puzzled. "How can you hear a tree?" She smiled secretively. "Yep, just a big hollow tree." "So why don't I trust that smile?" Phoenix stared at her. She punched him on the arm. "Come on, let's go." "Wait," Marcus sounded urgent. They all looked at him. "Did you hear that?" He stood still with one finger raised, turning his head slowly. The others stopped and listened hard. Nothing. Bryn opened his mouth to make a smart comment when they all heard it. The sound of many stealthy feet creeping inexpertly through the sodden forest around them. Jade closed her eyes and turned in a circle. "Romans," she stated. "About 50 of them." She opened her eyes. I was too busy listening to the tree to hear them before. There are too many for me to put a control spell on and too many to fight. Frowning, she looked around and shivered. There's something else out there, too. I can't tell what. Something that's hunting the Romans. It's hungry. Clutching at Phoenix's arm, she stared at him, wide-eyed. "It's getting closer, and so are the soldiers. We have to move, now." She tugged him toward the great tree. Phoenix hesitated, drawing his weapon. He'd prefer to fight his way out again than to hide like a coward. He glanced around, seeing flashes of red through the undergrowth on either side of the path. They'd prevailed once. Surely they could do it again. Jade yanked again at his arm, even as she gave Bryn a push toward the tree. "What's the point of hiding in a tree?" Phoenix growled. "They'll know we're there and just smoke us out or burn the tree." Jade snorted, and he glanced around at the soggy forest. "Okay," Phoenix growled. "Then they'll just wait us out. We can't stay in there forever. We should fight." "Go, Marcus," Jade insisted. "Now, Bryn, run." She turned back to Phoenix and muttered fiercely, "Trust me on this. The Romans are the least of our worries. We do not want to be here when that thing that's hunting arrives. I promise we will not be trapped inside. But you have to run now." When he still didn't move, she sent him a despairing look, let go, and dashed away toward the great tree with long, swift strides. Her hood fell back, and her long hair fluttered like a tattered, wet flag behind her. All three of his companions were now almost at the dark entrance to the tree. Phoenix was still rooted, undecided. The adrenaline rush of battle surged through his warrior's body. He wanted to fight them. He was strong. Why should he run? Phoenix heard a twig crack behind him. Suddenly, the kid in him realized the idea of fighting 50 trained Roman soldiers and one beast of the dark woods on his own was pretty insane. There was bravery, and then there was sheer stupidity. He wasn't stupid. He ran. Behind him, Phoenix heard shouts of anger and frustration as the Romans realized the last of their prey was escaping. The sound of many feet running, branches snapping, leather armor creaking and weapons clanging dogged his footsteps. They were gaining. He had only about 20 meters to go. He was going to make it. 4 soldiers stepped out onto the path ahead, blocking his escape. They lowered javelins and waited with set faces and planted feet for him to impale himself. More appeared to either side, so he couldn't leave the path. Phoenix saw and gritted his teeth. Instead of stopping, he increased speed. The soldiers began to look slightly anxious. When he was only meters away from the end of their spear tips, they looked downright worried. Inside, Phoenix was worried as well. He thought he could do what he intended, but part of him wasn't sure. The 13-year-old part. Pushing fear aside, he drew a deep breath and screamed, the loudest, most terrifying war cry he could summon. One of the soldiers took an involuntary step back, shocked by the ferocity of this suicidal Breton warrior. The tips of 2 javelins lowered slightly. Phoenix made his move. With a mighty effort, he increased his speed again and bunched his thigh muscles. Then he sprang. It was an impossible leap, especially since he somersaulted in midair and sliced down and back with his sword as he went. The blade connected with the unprotected back of one soldier, who then fell heavily against his companions, clutching at their arms. It caused enough confusion that Phoenix was able to complete his maneuver unchallenged. In the real world, he would have simply crashed headlong into the Roman soldiers or been skewered by their spears. Fortunately, in this world, it seemed the impossible was sometimes possible. He landed lightly, allowed his legs to collapse, and executed a reasonable Aikido roll. Letting his momentum carry him, he came to his feet and dashed the last few steps to the tree. Shouts and footfalls behind him said he was only just ahead of his pursuers. He stripped the shield from his back as he ran and slid sideways into the narrow gap. It was a tight squeeze into dubious safety. Inside the tree, he skidded to a stop in pitch blackness and utter silence. Confused, Phoenix spun to look for the opening. There ought to be light or at least angry Romans coming through it. There was nothing. Fighting rising panic, he blinked a couple of times and rubbed his eyes. Was he blind? The darkness was so absolute that it almost felt thick. The silence so complete that he could hear only his own harsh breathing and creaking leather. Cautiously, he reached out and turned a slow circle, but touched nothing. "Hello?" His voice sounded muffled, the blackness a blanket soaking up sound and light. Clearing his throat, he tried again. "Jade? Marcus? Bryn?" There was no answer. He was alone. Chapter 13. Drawing 3 long, deep breaths to calm himself, Phoenix tried to slow his thundering heart. He had to think. He'd gone into the body of the huge oak tree. Bryn, Marcus, and Jade had all done the same, so logically, they should be here. Where was here? This thick, heavy blackness didn't fit with his idea of what the inside of a tree should look like. There should be dirt, wooden walls, maybe some water dripping, a few bugs, even bats, not nothing at all. He jumped up and down a few times. The floor felt soft underfoot, but when he reached a hand down, he couldn't actually tell where the ground began. It was a weird sensation. His fingers met resistance, but he couldn't feel anything with his fingertips. He sheathed his sword and rehung his shield over his back. Pulling out flint and tinder, he attempted to strike a light by touch alone. Even though he could hear the rocks clicking together, there weren't any visible sparks. Angry and frightened, Phoenix tucked them away again with jerky movements and wished for an electric torch. He yelled out, "Bryn! Marcus! Jade! Where the heck is everyone?" His voice sounded thin and stifled. Something touched his shoulder. He yelped in shock, spinning and half-drawing his sword in quick reaction. A hand grabbed his, forcing it down. "Wait!" It was Marcus's voice, also sounding strangely quiet. "It's me." Phoenix was almost sick with relief and glad the Roman boy couldn't see his face. He slid his sword into the scabbard and gripped the other's arm. "Where are we? Where are Bryn and Jade?" "Bryn's here with me," Marcus replied, a little louder now. Phoenix could feel a warm breath on his arm. Bryn's small hand found his and held on. Even though it gave him the creeps not to be able to see the others, he didn't pull away. He needed their company right now, and it felt like they needed his. "Jade." There was a pause, and Phoenix's stomach lurched. Had she been captured? Then Bryn's voice replied shakily from somewhere down by his elbow. "She's carrying us." Again, Phoenix was glad they couldn't see him. He just knew there was a totally stupid, blank look on his face right now. Bryn must have sensed his confusion, for he continued, "We didn't have time to warn you. We're inside the Hylian Bagia." Phoenix choked back shock as his knees sagged a little. "How? Why?" he stammered. "And most importantly, how do we get out?" Bryn renewed his grip on Phoenix's hand. "It was the best idea we could come up with," he said meekly. I said you wouldn't like it, but Jade insisted. We were inside the oak tree, watching the Romans corner you. The boy squeezed Phoenix's hand. Brilliant jump, by the way. Phoenix couldn't help but grin, even though the boy couldn't see him. He cleared his throat and frowned. So how is being in the bag supposed to help us? If she gets caught by the Romans, we'll be stuck here forever. Anger, pushed on by fear, built in his guts. This was what he got for trusting anyone but himself. If there was no one on the outside to call their names, they might never escape this magic prison. No, no. Bryn tugged on his arm. She won't get caught. The Romans won't find her. Phoenix snorted. Right. Like there are so many places she can hide inside a tree. She'll be caught and imprisoned and will never get out of here. Don't get me wrong, he added. I like you guys, but I really don't fancy the idea of being trapped in a magic bag for the rest of my life with you. With a frustrated grunt, he shook himself free of Bryn's clutch. Marcus grabbed his elbow again, his fingers tightening and finding sensitive pressure points until Phoenix yelped in surprise. If you'll give us a chance, we can explain, he said quietly. Phoenix subsided, muttering, Fine. Explain then. He had been behaving like a fool, but it was really annoying to have Marcus point it out. Bryn drew a deep, shaky breath. Jade recognized the oak tree as one belonging to the Dryads. I think she meant the tree Tolwith Teg, the fairy folk, he explained as Phoenix drew breath to ask what the heck a Dryad was. Yes, Marcus struck in. Dryad is the Greek word for the tree folk. Bryn hurried on. She knew that she could gain access to the fairy realm through the tree, but we wouldn't be allowed, and neither would the Romans. So she stuck us in a magic bag, and here we are, Phoenix finished, waiting to find out if she really did escape into some other land or not. Great, he sighed and reached out in the pitch black to find Bryn's thin shoulder. Squeezing it, he tried to let the kid know there were no hard feelings. He wasn't very good at apologizing. So what do we do now? He asked the darkness. We wait. Marcus's calm reply came after a short pause. Phoenix groaned. Somehow, I knew you were going to say that. Jade stuffed the bajia into her pack and glanced over her shoulder. The entrance to the oak shelter darkened with the approach of angry soldiers. Placing a hand on the wood either side of the split, she spoke to the great tree in Elvish. With a deep, creaking groan, the tree shuddered in response. Yells of surprise sounded outside as the opening began to creak closed. Jade kept her hands on the walls, willing the tree to heal itself faster, to close the entrance enough so the soldiers couldn't get in. A javelin jabbed through the hole. Jade gasped and just managed to swivel her body aside. It missed her stomach by millimeters. The leering face of a Roman soldier appeared in the narrowing gap. She backed away. The opening was too narrow to admit a man now, but he could still see her. He laughed coarsely. That's okay, girlie. You stay right there. We're getting axes, and we'll have you out soon enough. Frightened and angry, Jade stepped forward and poked two long fingers through, into the man's squinting eyes. He screamed and fell back into the arms of his companions. The crack closed a few more inches. Desperately, she looked around. She couldn't allow the tree to be injured. The Dryads would never forgive her if she let the Romans hack at it with axes. Leaning her forehead against the wood, she asked the great life another question and gave it certain instructions. There was a suggestion of slow thought and agreement, followed by a brief, confusing sense of oneness. A moment when Jade actually felt like she was part of the tree. She completely understood the problems of too little sun and too much rain, the annoyance of small burrowing insects, and the joy of sheltering living things, the sorrow of watching their warm, brief lives pass, the sleep of winter, and the rebirth of spring. Her own problems seemed insignificant. Smiling, Jade lifted her head and looked about. A small door had appeared in the timber next to her. A deep, snarling roar reverberated through the dark woods, startling her in the act of reaching for the door handle. She peered out, then flinched back at the sight of a full-grown ogre emerging from the forest behind the Romans. Standing well over 4 meters, its gnarled, wood-colored skin looked as tough as old oak. Each of 4 muscular arms ended in 6-fingered hands, tipped in razor-sharp claws. A small head sat on broad shoulders. Its 8 beady black eyes were placed strategically so it could see in all directions. Most frightening of all was the mouthful of jagged saber teeth designed to slice through skin and bone without effort. Jade shrank into the darkness as the Romans formed up ranks. They didn't seem very happy when their officers ordered an attack. A javelin and dozens of arrows bounced off its thick skin, serving only to enrage it. The ogre casually picked up the closest soldier and shook him until things cracked, and he stopped yelling. Jade's stomach heaved. The monster picked up a second soldier, using him as a club to bowl over a half-dozen of his companions. The Romans broke rank at last, ignoring their officers in favor of running for their lives. The ogre stayed, sitting down amongst the dead. He chortled and growled, surrounded by a pathetic pile of scarlet and leather, flesh and bone. Jade closed her eyes to the carnage, grateful that she had an escape route that didn't involve going past that beast. Even so, she would have nightmares for days. She patted the wood thankfully, then slipped through the portal. It closed behind her and disappeared. Jade entered the Dryad realm with fear in her heart. Yes, the great oak had called to her, even accepted and helped her. The Dryads would already be aware of that. Surely they would be hospitable to a half-elf if their trees were. She wasn't certain of her reception, though. Her character's human mother had kept her away from the great forest and its inhabitants. She didn't even know who her elvish father was. She was just hoping and praying that the tree fairy folk would accept her as kin, or at least let her pass through unharmed. If they didn't, it was frightening to feel so alone. The others' lives were literally in her hands. If she failed, then they would all die. Swallowing her fears down as best she could, Jade drew a shaky breath. Clenching her hands around her staff, she trod through a dimly lit tunnel. The walls were hard to see. They seemed to be wooden, but she couldn't be sure. Each time she looked directly at them, they appeared shift and move, until her eyes almost crossed in an effort to focus. Even eerier was the feeling that she was traveling great distances with every small step. It was as though the ground was sliding out from beneath her feet. She truly was in the Anoeth, the timeless land. Jade shook her head and tried hard to ignore the weirdness. Gradually, the tunnel brightened, and the walls and floor assumed the more comfortable appearance of packed earth. Ahead, a narrow wooden door appeared. Even its handle and hinges were wood. She stopped at the doorway and took a deep breath. Nervousness fluttered in her stomach. Lifting the latch handle, she eased the door open and peered around it. Beyond lay a large, lofty, windowless room decorated in soft autumn shades and lit by a gentle golden glow from some unknown source. The walls were of living wood, and Jade realized that this room was somehow inside the great oak tree. Throwing her shoulders back, she stepped in and closed the door gently behind her. A soft, somehow ancient voice by her side made her jump and gasp. "My tree tells me you claim sanctuary in our land, young one. You have brought our enemy to our doorstep, to my beloved tree. I had to call a guardian to dispose of them. By what right do you now ask for our help?" Jade looked at the tall, extraordinary woman beside her and instinctively did the right thing. She dropped to one knee and bowed her head in utmost respect. This was, without a doubt, the grande dame of the tree folk. She had to be the dryad who guarded the giant oak. "My lady," she choked. I meant no disrespect. I am sorry if I've placed your tree in danger." I heard her in my mind and didn't know where else to go in this forest. The dryad cut her off, but not unkindly. "I understand, girl, but state your case quickly. I have felt your passage through my forest. The only reason you still live is that you spared this strangler when you could have killed it. For this you have been left alone by the dark folk and admitted to my presence. Speak, or I shall have you returned to the Romans who await without, or what's left of them." When Jade could not find her voice, the dryad spoke again, a little less harshly. "I am Orphanon. What may I call you?" Her name translated to Gold Queen. Jade risked another quick look at this fascinating lady. At first glimpse, she had seemed young and stunning with golden skin, amber eyes, and rippling hair the rich red of autumn leaves. Now, as Jade looked again, she could see physical signs of age. A few strands of gray in that luxurious hair, a few crow's feet, wrinkles around the almond-shaped eyes. The dryad stood straight and firm, with a reassuring aura of strength and wisdom. But she was old beyond human understanding, even though she wore only a simple long dress of white linen and a wreath of golden oak leaves in her hair. The dryad carried herself like the queen she undoubtedly was. Jade managed to get her brain engaged, and she replied, giving her character name rather than her own. "My lady, I am called Jade Gen Eleri of the Cyfriniol forest. I seek only safe passage across Anoeth to escape from Roman soldiers who seek to capture and torture me." The lady stiffened. She was silent a moment, and Jade wondered if she'd said something wrong. "Rise, child," the dryad said after a moment, "and sit with me a while." Confused and relieved, Jade stood and followed her hostess to a nearby pile of cushions. Easing her backpack onto the floor, she crossed her legs beneath the low table that stood between her and the dryad queen. The door opened and another younger dryad entered, bearing a tray. She glanced at Jade, but didn't speak. Orphanon waved her out once the tray had been placed on the table. Jade eyed the array of enticing foods and tried not to drool. The queen did not invite her to eat, so she resolutely turned her eyes away. Orphanon was watching her with open curiosity. "You said your name was Jade Gen Eleri? Jade, daughter of Eleri?" she asked. Jade nodded. "Is your mother Eleri, spellweaver of the great Cyfriniol forest? Eleri, daughter of Bryken, the hunter?" Jade nodded again, blinking in shock as she searched her dual memories and confirmed to herself the names of her mother and maternal grandfather. How could she possibly know that? Yes, she was a half-elf, but she never expected to be even recognized by the fairy, let alone have her human ancestry known to a dryad queen. Orphanon smiled faintly and waved a hand at the loaded plates before them. "Eat, child." She reached out and patted Jade's hand. "Then you must tell me of your troubles, and I will see what I can do to help." Time passed, or at least, Phoenix assumed it passed. It was hard to tell when he was stuck in a bag. It took him a while to come to terms with the need to simply sit and wait for Jade to get them out. Having a warrior body and warrior brain, added to his own natural impulse to be moving and doing, meant he wanted action. He'd had enough of waiting and hoping in the real world. With nowhere to go in the bag, He paced and fretted. Finally, frustrated, he practiced Aikido kata in an attempt to get his warrior body to do what he wanted it to. It sort of worked, but he still felt stupidly uncoordinated and got more frustrated as his body didn't respond as easily to these moves as in the real world. At last, even Bryn's cheerful patience wore out, and the boy snapped at him to sit down. After that, they sat on the unseen, unfelt floor and shared out the remains of what edible food they had. Bryn produced some sort of whistle and piped lilting sweet tunes until he ran out of songs and had to stop for breath. Afterward, they talked in snatches for a while, but the conversation and music had eventually ended. Nothing changed. It was still suffocatingly dark and mind-numbingly boring. Marcus fell asleep with the amazing ability of a seasoned soldier to rest when and where he can. His deep, even breaths were barely audible. Even Bryn gave up his usual pert chatter in the face of the strange, muffling effect of the Hylian Bagia. He leaned against Phoenix's shoulder and occasionally sighed. In due course, Phoenix must have fallen asleep as well, for the next thing he knew, Marcus was shaking him. "Wake up." "What?" He blinked in the darkness. He rubbed gritty eyes, but it was still dark. "What's going on? Why'd you wake me up?" "Something's happening," Marcus said, his hand still gripping Phoenix's shoulder. "Wake Bryn." Phoenix shook the younger boy, and all three stared into the thick darkness. "So," Phoenix asked, "what's happening? I don't see anything." "I'm sure I heard Jade's voice," Marcus assured him. Phoenix sighed. "You were probably dreaming." "No," the other replied, unperturbed. "I'm certain I heard her." And there was a flash of light for a moment, like she'd opened the bag. "Well, if she did that," Phoenix pointed out, "why didn't she say our names and get us out?" "I don't know." Marcus had a hint of impatience in his normally calm voice. "But she might at any second, and I thought you'd like to be awake for it, rather than half asleep." Phoenix grunted, wondering if the eternal darkness and freakiness of this place was finally getting to the calmest member of their little band. It was nice to know something could ruffle Marcus's cool feathers. "There!" Bryn's high-pitched shout jolted Phoenix out of his musings. A flash of light overhead made him look up. Surely this was Jade hauling them out of oblivion. What he saw, silhouetted against the light, wasn't Jade's hand. Instead, it was a puzzlingly large, curved object that seemed to be both falling towards them and yet falling away from them at the same time. It appeared to be getting closer, but in a strange twist of logic defying physics, it was also shrinking as it got nearer. The three boys stood, dumbstruck, staring up at the object for several moments before the light vanished and took with it their ability to see anything at all. Bryn began. "I wonder where that thing will fall." Thunk. "Ow!" Phoenix clapped his hands to his head and howled in pain. "Ow! Bloody ow, 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 ow!" He doubled over, grasping his head tightly, as if pressure would somehow reduce the agony. Using more swear words than he even knew, he stamped hard on the non-ground, until even swearing and stamping wasn't helping anymore. "Are you all right?" Bryn's concern didn't help, nor did Marcus's soft snort of amusement. "Whatever that was," Phoenix replied crossly. "It hurt. Man." He fingered his scalp. "I've got a lump the size of a chicken egg on my head." He glared up at where the light had been and shook his fist, before realizing the gesture was wasted, because no one could see him. What the heck was Jade thinking, tossing something in with us like that? She could have killed me. What was it, anyway? "I don't know," Bryn replied, too cheerfully. "I can't find it now. I think it's part of the bag's magic. You called our names when you came in, so we found you." he explained. "Since we don't know what it was Jade threw in, we can't name it, and so we can't find it." "What?" Phoenix rubbed his scalp gently. "So if I said, Pilum, one would—" "Don't," Marcus cried, too late. "Ow, bloody ow again," Phoenix yelled. This time a Roman spear had whacked him on the arm. Ruefully, he rubbed his elbow and had to laugh. "That was pretty stupid. At least it wasn't the pointy end." Bryn giggled. "Well," Marcus tactfully didn't complete the sentence. "Still," Phoenix said at last, "I guess I'm just lucky she didn't toss something sharper in with us." Marcus and Bryn chuckled. There was a companionable silence for a few moments, then Bryn spoke again. "Did you hear that?" "What?" Marcus and Phoenix asked together. "I thought I heard someone call my name," Bryn replied doubtfully. There was a few seconds of silence as they all strained to hear. "Oh well," the boy laughed nervously. "Just wishful thin." There was a brief flash of blinding light. Before Phoenix could react, the comforting pressure of Bryn's thin leg against his own was gone. Phoenix leapt up with a shout of alarm. "Wait!" Marcus's yell and firm hand brought him up short. The only person who could have got Bryn out of here was Jade. His words were annoyingly reasonable. "She'll call us next, so just be patient," Phoenix growled. Once again he'd reacted first and thought later. It was so frustrating to have the Roman boy showing him up by being so darned cool, calm, and collected all the time. Phoenix scraped his fingers roughly through his hair. He had to get a handle on himself. Surely he hadn't always been like this. It must be this stupid digital warrior's fault. Back at home, he'd been really good at thinking before he acted. Or at least, he'd learned to be more that way after his mother remarried. Come to think of it, he frowned in the darkness. His real father used to tease him about being too reactive, too quick to get angry. He smiled, remembering many bruises, skinned knees and hands from his youthful schoolyard fight and daring adventures. He'd soon learn to curb his hazardous activities with Jacob watching his every move. Being grounded and threatened was good incentive to restrain himself. Okay, so maybe being here in 80 AD was just giving him an excuse to go back to his old, stupid ways. Maybe that wasn't such a good thing after all. "Marcus, do you think—" He never got to finish his question. There was another bright flash of light, and the last Phoenix saw of Marcus was the boy's startled, upturned face. Then it was dark. He was alone. Again. "Man," he muttered, fingering his still sore head. "I'm really getting sick of this." Chapter 14. Phoenix stumbled, blinking in the clear morning sunlight. Marcus steadied him as Jade tucked the magic bag into her pack. Boy, she was tired. The trip from the fairy realm had taken longer than expected. Led by one of the younger dryads, she'd covered over 2 days' walk in little over half a night. Sometime after midnight, the dryad had disappeared, and Jade had to assume she was on her own again. After using minor magic to find a suitable, dry, hollow log, she managed to sleep restlessly for a couple of hours before waking at dawn. Any hope of getting more rest before pulling the others out of the bag vanished after a quick peek at a nearby village. The hamlet was quite large, and several people were already heading into the woods to hunt or forage. If she slept any longer unguarded, someone was certain to find her. Reluctantly, Jade retreated further into the woods. Feeling rather like a Las Vegas illusionist, she hauled her companions out of the bag one at a time. Bryn popped out all chirpy and full of how interesting it had been to be stuck in the bag. She'd needed his help to pull Marcus out next. The Roman boy thanked them politely before giving Jade's face a close inspection. He pursed his lips at the sight of her dark circled eyes and pale complexion. Jade was grateful he hadn't scolded her. It took all three of them to heave Phoenix out. He looked tired as well, but more than a little pleased to be out in the world again. Heaving a sigh of relief, he sucked in a deep breath of cool forest air and spread his arms wide. Man, am I glad to be out of there. I'm starving and thirsty, and I really have to take a leak. He shook his empty water bottle. Jade pointed silently at a nearby stream cascading over dark rocks. While the others refreshed themselves in various ways, Jade kept watch, wondering if she'd make through the day without falling asleep on her feet. The thought of another day of hard walking made her want to just sit down and refuse to move. She was beyond tired. It was all just too much to process, too much to cope with. She'd hardly slept for days, fought peasants and Romans, talked to trees and dryads, healed wounds and saved lives. Wasn't that enough? Didn't she deserve a break? Maybe if she just put her head down on this log for a few minutes. Jade, wake up. It was Phoenix's voice, his hand on her shoulder. We can't stay here. We've got to get to Stonehenge before the Romans, remember? Come on, get up. Jade shoved his hand off, rolling away so he wouldn't see the tears of exhaustion in her eyes. Go away, Phoenix. Leave me alone. I'm tired. I can't do this anymore. I don't care. Come on, he pushed. You've just had a cruisy night with the dryads when we've been stuck in a bag. How bad could it have been? She jolted upright, glaring at him. Cruisy. I spent most of the night walking. I've taken 2 days off our trip while you've been sleeping. You're welcome, by the way. Turning her face away, she clenched her fists hard, trying to keep back the salt tears that threatened to drown her eyes. She wouldn't go all girly now. Why didn't anyone ever just say, "Thanks, great job"? Why wasn't anything she did ever good enough? There was a long, awkward silence, then Bryn cleared his throat. There's a village just over the rise. If I can recognize it, I should be able to tell where we are and how far we still have to go. It might even be a place we can rest for a while. Do you think you can make it that far, Jade? Jade sniffed and scrubbed her sleeve across her face. She stood up, leaning on her staff as the world spun a little. Marcus's arm appeared and she borrowed his strength gratefully. I'll be okay. I'm just tired, that's all. I'll make it. We don't really have a choice. Let's go. She followed Bryn, not looking at Phoenix as she passed him. She felt a bit silly for lashing out at him. It wasn't his fault she had agreed to push on through the night. How was he supposed to know she hadn't been given the royal VIP treatment? Orphanon had been wonderful, but it made it clear that they had a very limited time left to succeed in their first quest. She had confirmed what the old lady in their limbo vision said. They had to get the jewel from the keepers before the Romans and before the spring equinox. She'd even revealed that the keepers were the druids, and that the equinox was only 2 days away. If they failed to get the jewel and keep it from the Romans, their quest would be over. Judai would win. Their chance to finish and get home would be gone. In fact, the home they knew would be gone if Judai took control of this world. She still didn't really understand how that worked, but it seemed she had to take it on faith. Time was running out, and with it Jade's confidence. It was too hard. She was too worn out. They'd never make in time, and she'd be stuck here, her own life lost or destroyed. Catching her breath on a sob, Jade scrubbed at her face with the coarse fabric of her sleeve. Hey! Phoenix's voice from behind drew Jade's attention. She slowed to let him catch up, glad of the distraction from her depression, but wary after his previous ungrateful attitude. She really shouldn't have taken her fears out on him, though. I'm sorry. Sorry. They both spoke at once. Jade caught his eye and joined in with his rueful laughter. I shouldn't have snapped at you, she sighed. It's been a tough couple of days. An ogre came and ate some of the Romans while I was in the tree. She shuddered at the gruesome memory. Wow. Cool. And, gross, I guess. Phoenix paused, obviously not sure what to say to that. I should have seen how tired you are. He gave her an apologetic grimace. I guess when I'm ready to get moving, I sort of expect everyone else should be too. My mother's always telling me to stop and think before I open my mouth, but I suck at it. She cast him a quick smile, and my dad always says, it takes two to argue. He grinned. My dad said the same thing when I got into fights at school. Well, he amended. What he actually said was, he who strikes first admits he has run out of ideas, but it kind of meant the same thing. Probably. Jade laughed, her ill humor almost gone. She resolutely pushed aside her lingering fears and raised her head to look forward again. They walked on in silence for a while. Marcus caught them up. Jade smiled at him. Phoenix sighed and scrubbed stiff fingers through greasy hair. He winced. Jade caught his look. Are you okay? Yeah. He nodded. Just a bump on the head from whatever it was you threw in the bag with us last night. What was it, anyway? She stared at him, confused, then remembered. Oh, right. That was a gift from Orphanon for me. The two warriors looked at her. A horn, she added, when Phoenix gestured for her to continue. I'm supposed to blow it if we get into real trouble and help will come. Sweet. Phoenix's blue eyes lit with eager excitement. That's more like it. A really useful magic item. About time, too. Jade glanced at Marcus and saw that he, too, looked impressed, if a bit uneasy. Yeah, she agreed. But we can only use it 3 times, and only if we're in truly dire peril, and... She raised a warning finger. The help we get might not always be what we expect. Phoenix looked irritated by the limitations. What does that mean? No idea. Jade shrugged, a yawn distorting her words. I'm just repeating what Orphanon said, 3 times. Dire emergency, unpredictable outcome. Still, Phoenix slapped a hand on her shoulder. It's an extra trick up our sleeves we didn't have before. Better than nothing. She shrugged again, her whole body drooping with exhaustion. Listen, he frowned at her. Maybe Bryn's right. We can rest up in this village. Give you a chance to get your energy levels up again before we tackle the final part of this level. Thanks, Phoenix, she sighed. But we really don't have time. What do you mean? Surely if you've gained us so much ground, we're well ahead of the Romans now. She shook her head, repeating what the Dryad Queen had told her about the equinox and the Druids being the keepers of the jewel. Phoenix groaned, rubbing a dirty hand across his forehead. Well, at least we know who has it. Now we just have to find them before this equinox thing. Only 2 days. That's it? Man, we don't even know where we are yet. What's so important about the spring equinox, anyway? What is an equinox? Bryn's soft call cut short whatever explanation Jade had been about to embark on. Which was good, as Phoenix had regretted his impulsive question the second it left his lips. The boy was crouched behind a tree, waving frantically at them to take cover. Phoenix hurried to his side and peered around the bole of the tree. Below, cleared ground sloped away from the forest, down toward a fortified village. They had approached the town from the southwest, through the last stands of trees. Bryn pointed and whispered, We've been lucky. The Dryads have brought us over the Ploonida, through the worst of the Dewilush Brenau, and out the other side. That's the river Kennet, just north, and the village is Cunetio. It used to be just farmland, but now it's Roman. See? Surrounding the small settlement was a 2-meter-high defensive wall of earth with a deep ditch on its outside. Marcus murmured that there would be a similar ditch directly inside the earth wall. Peaked, red-tiled roofs of at least 20 stone and wood houses could be seen neatly lined up inside the fortified area. 2 major roads bisected the town, one leading east-west and one northwest to southeast. Bryn pointed to the latter. That's the road we'll need to follow to get to the Great Stone Circle. We follow it for about 3 hours, then turn southwest, cross a small river, and we're there. The boy glanced up at Phoenix. If we leave now, we could just about make it by nightfall, even if we stick to the fields. Phoenix looked longingly at the town, thinking of beds, decent food, and shelter. He could hear dogs and children running about with barks and shrieks of laughter. A group of 4 women walked into the village, carrying buckets made of animal hide. Water slopped on the ground as the women chatted and laughed. A farmer led a plow beast out to a nearby field. The scene looked harmless, domestic, and peaceful. Surely they could risk one night for the sake of a decent sleep and full stomachs. He looked at his companions, intending to announce that they should spend the night in Cunicio. Jade's face was drawn and resigned. Bryn eyed the town with yearning and fear. Marcus's handsome face was hard, his return gaze unblinking. Staring at their expressions, Phoenix abruptly realized something vital. The decision wasn't his alone. If he were captured, the worst he could expect was to be forcibly drafted into the Roman army. Jade and Marcus would suffer far worse fates. Bryn would probably be made into a slave or servant at best. As much as he wanted to, he had no right to make this decision for them. Reluctantly, he pushed aside his own desire. What do you guys think we should do? Should we stay here and get some rest? Or should we push on and try to get closer to Carrega Amgarn? There was approval in Marcus's dark eyes. Jade and Bryn exchanged looks before replying together. We push on. Marcus nodded his agreement. Phoenix suppressed a sharp twinge of regret. Fair enough, but we need to find somewhere warm, comfortable, and safe to sleep. Agreed. Agreed, the others chorused wholeheartedly. So, they shouldered their burdens once more and gave Cunetio and its promise of comfort a wide berth. As they slipped away, Jade reached out for Phoenix's hand and gave it a quick squeeze. Phoenix gripped her slim fingers in return, feeling more at peace with himself than he had for many months. Perhaps his father had been onto something about this do the right thing business. 2 nights before, Marcus had assumed him to be the leader of this expedition. At the time, Phoenix had almost laughed. He'd never been the leader of anything, not even his football team. It had been an attractive idea, though. Leader. He'd spent quite a while in the bag thinking about it. After all, leaders got to tell people what to do, and they had to do it. They had control. They had power. That was what he'd wanted when he'd started this game. Control over his own life. The power to make his own decisions. Now he was having to rethink the whole thing. Maybe being a leader wasn't just ordering and being obeyed. Maybe it was more. Phoenix frowned, unable to follow the thought through to completion. He didn't know what it was, just that it wasn't what he'd always thought. It wasn't just being a bossy control freak. Leadership was something entirely different. But what? Unable to come to a conclusion, he sighed, shelving the idea for later thought. Right now he just had to make sure they all made it to Stonehenge before the Romans and before the spring equinox. Whatever that was. In spite of the lack of covering forests in this part of the country, the travelers made good time. They stayed away from the road, moving along edges of fields and keeping a close eye out for Roman centuria. Whenever those distinctive scarlet and leather uniforms appeared, the 4 immediately sought cover. Since it was spring, the field crops weren't yet high enough to hide in, but there were plenty of hedges, stone walls, small shepherd's huts, and groves of trees. Once, however, The party was obliged to throw themselves flat amongst the plowed furrows and stay perfectly still as a Roman runner messenger sped past in the distance. When the sound of running feet had disappeared, Jade raised her head and stared down the road. I wonder why he was in such a hurry. What do you mean? Phoenix wasn't particularly worried by a non-threatening runner. Jade frowned. I might just be paranoid, but that's the third messenger we've seen on the road this morning. I'm just worried that Feng Zhudai might be on our trail. Phoenix looked at her in astonishment. But how could he? He glanced around the open fields, his hands spread. You cut 2 days off our trip. How could the cohort looking for Marcus possibly catch up to us? Or even know where we're going in the first place? She grimaced. I don't know, I just know there's something wrong. I feel uneasy. He chuckled. That's an understatement. Of course there's something wrong. This whole place is wrong on several levels. He grinned at her. If you'll forgive the pun. Jade didn't respond in kind. She just shook her head. Don't forget that Judai is some sort of arch-wizard. If we do have to win through all 5 Lev quests, and we succeed by some fluke, then he's in big trouble. She gripped his arm and dropped her voice to a whisper. Is it possible that he could know what our task is for each level of the game and try and stop us? Phoenix stared at her for a moment, at least considering her words. He shook his head firmly. No, that is just paranoid. There's hundreds of players, remember? Judai couldn't possibly be in all places trying to thwart all of them at once. Yes, she said slowly, but they're not here yet, and we are. We're here for a reason, remember? We're the only ones with... She tapped her chest and raised an eyebrow significantly, reminding him of their amulets. As far as we know, he returned. Let's get moving and stop trying to second-guess ourselves. We have a jewel thingy to steal, remember? He gestured for Bryn to keep moving, and they all fell into line again. Oh, I remember. Jade nodded vigorously. And do you remember that we still have no idea how we're going to steal it, or even what it looks like? I know. He was irritated by her persistence. They'd work it out as they went. Jade wouldn't let it go, though. Phoenix, she insisted, grabbing his arm and pulling him up short. We have to have a plan. We can't just run in like waving swords around like idiots and expect the jewel to fall into our laps. At least we know the keepers are the druids. But how are we going to get the jewel from the druids? I could always just ask Druid to get it for us. Bryn's clear voice piped up. Chapter 15. Jade and Phoenix stopped dead in their tracks, staring down at the boy. Who, Phoenix said deliberately, is Druid? Bryn gaped at them in wide-eyed innocence. My brother, of course. The one my Danai brought here to become a druid. Remember? Jade covered her eyes with her hand and groaned. How could they have forgotten that? Phoenix let out a crack of laughter. Marcus raised surprised brows. I'd completely forgotten about your brother. Phoenix slapped a hand to his forehead. I never knew about him, Marcus murmured. Jade laughed this time, the thought of an easy solution lifting her spirits. Phoenix crouched in the turned earth, staring hard at Bryn. Do you think Druid would be willing to help us? Won't know until I ask, will I? The boy grinned lopsidedly. He'll be glad to see me, I know that. Well, as plans go, it's not foolproof. Phoenix scraped his fingers through his hair and stood up. But I guess it's worth a shot. It'd certainly be the easiest way to complete our quest. He sent a quick look at Marcus and Jade and gave them a twisted smile. But it would be a bit anticlimactic. I think I could gladly skip a few battles and chases for a little success and boredom, Jade said fervently. Really? Phoenix returned in mock surprise. you'd skip a good bloodthirsty skirmish with the Romans just to get to the next quest. Jade pretended to consider his question in all seriousness. Get home, you mean? Let me think. Yes, I'm pretty sure I would. Give me a nice, calm, and peaceful trade with Bryn's brother any day. Well, Phoenix clapped Bryn and Jade on the back and gave them a little shove in the right direction. Let's hope that's what you get. But personally, I'll be absolutely stunned if it is. Jade wrinkled her nose at him, annoyed that he had to burst her bubble of hope. With lighter hearts, they made good time for the rest of the morning. By noon, though, Jade was totally wrecked and called a halt. She had reached the end of her energy reserves. Marcus found an abandoned wattle and daub hut, and they all crowded inside. Phoenix pulled the very unappetizing remains of half-smoked birds from his pack. Bryn made a disgusted face. None of them relished the idea of eating it, but they had nothing else. Jade, with a smug smile, told Phoenix to throw it away and reached into the Hylian Bagia. Bryn groaned in appreciation at the sight of elf-cooked foods spread out on a cloth on before them. There were fruits of every description, nuts, berries, and cooked tubers, herb flatbreads, pies and egg dishes to die for, slow-roasted pork and lamb legs, water skins containing sweet water, light wines and juices. In humble silence, the four ate until their stomachs bulged. Reverently, they toasted the fairy folk's kindness and culinary skills. Afterward, not surprisingly, they all fell asleep. Jade dreamt she was washing her face. The water was kind of smelly and sticky, and the washcloth felt squishy on her cheek. For some reason, she was lying down on a very dirty bathroom floor. What the? Suddenly awake, she sat bolt upright and stifled a shriek as she almost butted heads with a too-friendly half-grown sheep. It bleated at her before trotting away. In disgust, Jade scrubbed her face with a sleeve. Sheep spit. Ew, she gasped, staring around at her motionless companions in horror. If a sheep had